thanks for all the support. Since we got 100 subs, we are going to be doing a giveaway for a $10 Gamestop gift card every week for this month. In order to enter the giveaway, like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell and comment below what you'd like to buy with the gift card. Alright, let's get into the video. Welcome back to Brothers in Gaming. I'm Jesse.
I'm Jared, the master of horrors.
Playing some Soul Calibur.
And I, as always, will be reading creepy internet stories for your viewing and listening pleasure. I have a tale for you, or two, depending on the time. I hope you enjoy. Hands. The worst thing I've ever done in my life happened about 12 years ago, when I was a 16-year-old kid living in Cleveland, Ohio. It was the early fall when the leaves were just starting to turn orange, and the temperatures were starting to fall, hinting at the freezing chill that was only a few months away. School had just started, but it had been going on for about a month now, so all the excitement of going back and reuniting with old friends had been replaced by the realization that we were captives in a place that only wanted to, well, load work upon us. Understandably, me and my friends were all eager to do anything that might remind us worry-free responsibility-free days of summer. Earlier that year, about the time the last school year had let out, one of my friends from work, McDonald's, which some people think is lame, but I always had a great time there, had taught me a technique to make yourself pass out with the help of an assistant. It always works something like this. One person would rapidly take 10 deep, heavy breaths, and on the 10th, squeeze his eyes shut, hold his breath as tightly as possible while crossing his wrist over his heart. The assistant would give the person a bear hug from behind and squeeze the person's wrist into his breastbone. Within seconds, the person holding their breath would lose consciousness. The assistant was then in a perfect position to make sure you didn't totally collapse and crack your skull on the sidewalk. The effect only lasted for a second or two. It wasn't like we were putting ourselves into comas or anything, but it felt like you'd been out for hours, and when you came to, the disoriented feeling of not knowing where the hell you were and what you were doing there was awesome. Now I know a lot of people are like, what the fuck, are you a fucking idiot? And yeah, I know, we were probably killing about 1 million brain cells each time we would knock ourselves out, and I think probably my memory has suffered for it. But to a bored-as-hell 16-year-old, I thought it was hella cool. All the effect of getting your lights punched out with none of the pain of getting hit in the face. And I would never recommend it to anyone. One interesting side effect of doing this, which was really most of the reason we did it, was that while you were out, you'd have extremely lucid, vivid dreams, which you could always recall upon awaking. After all, you were only asleep for 2 seconds. We were good kids and had never and would never try drugs, so to us, this was like a poor man's LSD. These visions in some way were usually related to what you were looking at right before you passed out. For example, once I dreamed that I was climbing a mountain, way up in the Himalayas or something, but there was a handrail there. Who the hell puts handrails at 20,000 feet? When I came to and remembered where I was, I realized I'd been looking at the staircase in the corner of my girlfriend's living room. Another time I had a vision of Fred Flintstone smiling and holding out his hand in front of a mural with the DARE logo. That's the Drug Abuse Resistance Education, a program cops teach in public school. You've probably seen bumper stickers. I woke up and saw that my friend Brett had been standing in front of me right before I slipped into dreamland and had that logo on his shirt. Where Fred Flintstone came from, I have no idea. The visions were always mundane things like those, always, until that one day. Like I said, school had been going on for about a month and we were already sick of it. We were hanging out one Saturday in the field, which was really an easement for the electric company to run their high voltage lines. A few of us were sitting on the metal beams at the bottom of one of the towers. My friend Mike was climbing up to the second tier of beams so that he could jump the 8 or 10 feet to the ground. I thought it was stupid, but hey, I'm the guy who thought it was cool to induce unconsciousness by starving my brain of oxygen. It was a warm day for October, but the light gray of the sky was slowly getting darker. And in Cleveland in October, that probably meant that before long, the temperature would soon drop from a comfortable 70 to about 50 in the course of a few minutes, and if we were really lucky, an ice-cold rain would start to fall. The air was already damp and heavy, and we could hear the quiet buzzing of high-tension wires above us. I didn't want to spend the last few moments of a pleasant Saturday afternoon watching this dumbass climb partway up a high-tension tower, jump down and complain about how that one killed his feet, only to climb up and do the same thing over again. Hey, let's make ourselves pass out, I said. By that time, it wasn't as much fun as it had been in the early summer when we first discovered it, but it was a hell of a lot better than what we were doing. Vince was up for it, and so was Richard, but Mike, the guy jumping off of the tower, said, "What the fuck are you talking about?" "Holy crap, you haven't been knocked out before?" Vince asked. "No," was the response. Mike had been at his mom's house all summer, so he hadn't been in on the fun that we've been having. "Dude, you gotta try this. Watch, we'll show you." Vince and I got off the tower, stood in the grass at the center, and I did the customary 10 deep breaths. I squeezed my eyes shut, held my breath so hard that if they hadn't been shut, they'd have probably popped out of my head. Then I felt my friend clamp down on my arms in front of my chest, and suddenly, as if there were nothing more natural in the world, there were a giant lobster climbing around a lobster cage, and I was under the ocean with seaweed growing from the sandy bottoms of my feet. The next thing I remember, I was awake. Vince and Richard were asking me, "Dude, what did you see? What'd you dream?" The back of my head was killing me. Fuck, did you let me fall? I wasn't really that heavy, but Vince was pretty weak. He just stood there looking guilty, and Richard told me he had. "What'd you see, though?" he asked. I rubbed my head and said it was a lobster. It was his head off with its claws. I turned to Mike, watching from the L-shaped beams above, and said, "See, it's fucking awesome." "Whatever, I don't trust any of you enough to do that shit to me." "Come on, man, you gotta try it. It's no more dangerous than what you're doing right now. I promise I won't let you fall like this bitch did." He squinted in the way that people do when they're trying to decide if what they're thinking of doing is worth the risk or trouble. He jumped down one last time, got up and said, "Fine. Once." If only he would have thought a little longer, or had just flatly refused. He repeated the 10 deep breaths with me as the assist to make sure that he didn't fall. He held his breath, and I helped him slip into that other place. It's something I've regretted ever since, and when I think back on all the things I wish I'd done differently in my teenage years, girls I should have tried for, classes I should have tried harder in, all of the things I should and shouldn't. Putting him in that bear hug and squeezing him unconscious is the thing I most regret. I felt the dead weight shift from his feet onto my chest, and he was a pretty big guy, but I made sure to let him down easy, not knock his head against the hard-packed earth. Just as I laid him on the grass, he came back, and he woke up screaming. "Fuck, holy fuck, get away, get away, get away," he screamed as he leaped up to his feet and flailed his arms around his head. We all jumped back, afraid of being hit in this frenzy, but more afraid, so scared we almost shit our pants of what we were seeing. After about 5 seconds, which is about twice the time it normally takes a person to realize where they're at and remember what they're doing, he slowed down. Shit. Shit, holy shit, he was breathing heavily, gasping, deep breaths, hunched over at the corner of the tower. It's a wonder that his maddened state didn't run right into the supports and knock himself out for real. But he just stood there, bent over at the waist, and then fell to his knees. With his back turned to us, he starts rocking and wringing his hands and muttering to himself. "Holy mother of fuck," said Vince. "What the hell did you see?" But Mike didn't answer. We approached him slowly, and as we drew near, we could hear him quietly sobbing. In our macho world, that would normally be a crime punishable by death, but at the time, of course, we didn't say a word. I reached out a hand to his shoulder, but as soon as I touched him, a touch so tentative and light that he shouldn't have even been able to feel it, He shrieked and jumped away, clanging his back into the corner of the tower. He pressed up hard against it, staring at us with a look of terror in his eyes so real you'd think we were demons from the pit of hell. If ever in those few moments I thought that he was putting on to fuck with us, that look put all my doubt to rest. That and what happened afterwards, of course. None of us said anything, but after about 10 minutes, Mike had calmed down enough to his feet and lead him back to his house. As I had suspected, the temperature had fallen like crazy in just a few minutes, and, just as I figured it would, the freezing cold drizzle started to fall. I told Vince I was just going to go home and I'd see him tomorrow. We always spent the evenings and rainy days playing Mortal Kombat on SNES, but he didn't object. I think he probably wanted some time alone to reflect on what horrible thing we had just done to our friend, just like I did. The next day I went to see how Mike was doing, but he and his dad were gone the whole day. I asked him later where he went, but he wouldn't tell me. I think it must have been to a psychiatrist, because by Tuesday, the next time I saw him, he seemed to be better, a little zoned out. I figure he got some drugs to calm his nerves, but that's just my guess. I never really found out. Over the next few days, the four of us hung out, and while Mike was quiet, he didn't say anything about what had happened. We just talked about stupid, unimportant stuff. Girls we liked, classes at school that we hated. I wish we'd said something to him now, though I don't know if it really would have helped. We had no idea what we were facing, and to this day, I still have no clue. But we avoided the subject of what happened that Saturday, and the practice of passing out in general like it was the plague. It wasn't until the following Saturday that he said anything related to what happened to him. We were walking down the quiet street of our neighborhood toward the wooden footbridge that crosses the creek that runs between the houses, separating the development into two halves. I was going on about this hot girl who was a grade above me and who, consequently, wouldn't give me the time of day, and he, staring at the ground, walked on with his hands in his pockets. Suddenly, out of nowhere, and right in the middle of one of my sentences, he says, "I won't be around much longer." Huh? They'll be coming in tonight, and I don't think I'll be able to keep them out this time. Hey, what are you talking about? Who's coming tonight? The hands. The voices. At this point, I was like, holy shit. I could feel my breathing get quick and shallow. I felt my face and hands get hot to hear him talk so matter-of-factly about some horror that I couldn't even imagine. But I'll never forget that conversation. It's etched into my mind like the stone tablets in the Ten Commandments. I stammered a few times and then said, stupidly, "What hands?" At night, I look at the tree out my window, and then it goes black. And the hands, dozens, 100 of them, push in against the glass. And what do? I push back all night. But I'm tired. I can't keep them out anymore. The voices say I have to let them in. Little kid voices, little kid hands. He lowered his voice to a whisper, but I could tell in what he said next that he was struggling to keep the panic at bay. "Sometimes I see their faces," he said in his trembling voice. We had come to the walkway up to his house. He stopped and finally lifted his face to me. "Tell Vince he can have my Super Nintendo. He don't have one, and his mom sure as hell won't buy him one. Richard can have my CDs. I like rap, but he does." I started to say something, but he turned and walked up to his house. He went inside, closed the door. How I wish I'd went up there and knocked. Told him I would have stayed the night, but we were 16, and at that age, guys didn't do that anymore. So I just went home. I didn't even answer the door for Vince when he came over later. When I went to bed, I didn't sleep well, and I was constantly listening to every creak and groan that the house made. listening for the voices of a multitude of children. I normally slept with the curtains open, but tonight I closed them tight. The next day, we learned someone had broken into Mike's house. A police car was there in his driveway, and I about shit a brick when I saw it. Later, my worst fears were confirmed when I learned that it was Mike's bedroom window that had been broken into. He was missing, was all they told us. The cop asked all three of us a ton of questions. People from the Center for Missing and Exploited Children came and asked us more. I'm sure I looked guilty as shit, but when I said I didn't know what happened, it was, after all, halfway true. They were looking for some pervert that had abducted Mike, so no matter how hard they were grilling me, they couldn't get any information relating to that, and of course, so they finally gave up. He was on milk cartons and missing children TV shows, but to this day, he is still an unsolved case. After it was all over, I went to the library to research what the fuck happened. But in those days, while the internet was a research tool, it was only for rocket scientists and people who could afford a $5,000 computer. I didn't find much. The closest thing that I think is related to something I only discovered later in my junior class on world history. Apparently, Egyptian priests used to seal themselves in coffins for just long enough to almost die. They would then be resuscitated so that they could relay the things they saw in the netherworld while they were dead to the other priest. I can only figure that perhaps the electricity in the air or the weather made Mike go under deeper than we ever had, and gave him an experience or something like what the Egyptian priest had. But Vince knocked me out too, almost in the same spot where Mike was standing when I did it to him. Could he have just been more receptive to the call of the other place? Or had knocking my head on the ground somehow jostled me free of their hold? I don't know, and I don't think I ever will. But sometimes it still makes me shiver. That was written by Unseen Wombat. Unseen Wombat, what a nice one. And a cool name. Yeah, that's a pretty good story because, you know, it's another one like you could really see that having happened to somebody. Like maybe they just saw something that fucked them up a little bit. If someone kidnapped that kid the next day, you'd be like, holy shit.
Yeah, definitely some good stories lately.
That is a good one. I like it. That was Hands by Unseen Wombat. Oh, I've got another one. Ooh, it's kind of a long one. I hope I've got time. We're gonna give it a shot here. I think I've got time. This is an interesting one. Well, I'll explain after anyway. This is called The Blue Man. If you see the blue man walk, mind to him you do not talk. For if you see the blue man smile, your sweet soul he will defile. From The Blue Man, a traditional folk ballad. Samuel Douglas drove home from town, taking the main highway instead of the usual back roads that he was particular to. He hadn't had much business in town, so his visit was short and sweet. Spending time talking to the other men who farm the area. The last few holes hadn't been bought out by any of the big conglomerates yet. It wouldn't be too long before Ned Harrison sold, though. Crops weren't doing well. Sick child in bed. Sell the land and get a pretty check in the mail. Maybe they'd even let you stay on and work the land. Sam shook his head. There would never be a time that he'd work another man's land, not for any amount of money. His was his and had been in his family ever since folks started coming out here to the Midwest. He'd be damned if he was ever going to be the one who let it go. Sam groped for the apple that was rolling around on the seat next to him. Part of Sarah's big project to get him to start eating right. Load him up with all kinds of fruit and vegetables before he went anywhere. So he'd get into the habit of it, she said. He finally grabbed a hold of the apple without taking his eyes off the road and took a bite. He'd never admit it, but maybe she was right. Damn fruit was growing on him. He snorted out loud at his wordplay. Thought about telling Sarah later. His thoughts drifted away as he saw a figure walking alongside the road, picking its way through the ditch and the weeds and the water. Hell of a day to be walking, especially since it was so hot. It was getting past 5 and the sun had already started its downward climb, but the sun's heat lingered here and could wear a fellow down while he was working. Sam got closer and he saw that it was a man, and a big one at that, walking tall with a big stride. He was dressed all in blue from head to toe. Sam slowed down, maybe give the walker a lift a ways, just to cut down on some of the distance, or at least some water. Sam always had a couple of bottles of water rolling around in here, another one of Sarah's contributions. He stopped the car alongside the man and leaned over to roll down the passenger side window. The man had stopped walking and just stood there. His blue denim jacket looked heavy and couldn't be helping the heat any. The man's jeans looked worn and faded, and Sam noticed there wasn't any mud on them, even though the man was standing inch deep in a puddle. "Hey there, you need a lift someplace," Sam called. The blue man turned on his heels, and black eyes took a hold of Sam's. The blue man smiled a radiant smile, showing most every one of his teeth. Sam leaned back onto his seat and stepped on the gas hard. The car roared forward, clouded the blue man with dust. Had Sam looked in the rearview mirror, he would have seen the man walking on as if nothing had happened, the smile fallen away like a dead weight. But Sam, startled, was far beyond caring and just kept on home, not speeding, but driving purposely, all the way up to his house. He parked out front next to their lone tree, where he'd always parked, and got out of the car. His apple laying forgotten on the floor with a single bite taken out of it. Sam walked stiffly up to the house, one foot in front of the other. He stopped on the porch, his heavy tread shaking the planks. He bent down and began to rummage in the old toolbox he always kept there, and Sarah was always putting back into the shed where it belonged. He found the hammer he was looking for and opened the screen door and walked into the house. The hammer hanging loosely from his right hand, Sarah was in the kitchen preparing something for dinner. Sam didn't know or care what it was. Sun caught her faded blonde hair as her head turned, and she opened her mouth to greet Sam, a smile beginning at the corners of her mouth. She stopped when she saw his eyes, though. They weren't Sam's anymore. The eyes she saw in Sam's face were black, impossibly black and dead. Sam's grip tightened on the hammer, and he brought it up and around and down. The first blow followed by a scream. The second silenced it. A third. Fourth. Fifth. He didn't stop until the handle splintered and broke in his hand. He walked into the dining room and reached for the top of the cabinet. Pulling down the shotgun in one smooth motion, he loaded it, methodically, mechanically. He held the barrel at his chin with his left hand. Reaching with his right, he struggled to reach the trigger, his fingers brushing it once, twice, and 3 times before he was able to bridge the gap. And then his face was gone. Neighbors couldn't explain it. Police didn't bother to try. They were so much in love, people said. Did he cheat? Did she? They all asked why. It's just the way things are sometimes, was the only answer that people could come up with. On lonely roads and old highways, the blue man walks and jaunts and sways. A cold black heart and ivory smile, he'll walk you down that last long mile. Franklin always liked to remind folks not to call him Franklin. No, sir, that's what his parents called him. Just call him Frankie. He'd lean in real close while he was saying this, letting you get a nose full of whatever he'd been drinking that night. Big Johnny Walker Hallowell ran the bar, and you could always tell he wanted to throw Frankie out on his ear. Frankie was always coming and drinking the cheap stuff, never leaving tips. And the man talked, oh dear God in heaven, the man just never knew when to shut up. From 9 to 12, Frankie would dominate his little corner of the bar with non-stop talking. Sports, politics, religion, just didn't matter. His mouth would flap from sunup to sundown. Now see, that's just what I've been trying to see. You see? Frankie tapped the bar with his finger a few times, a sound that would grate on Johnny's by night's end. Frankie's victim for the night was Joe Gamble, the only man unfortunate enough to be sitting near Frankie. Joe looked from side to side, hoping someone might save him. Johnny wasn't about to end up listening to Frankie all night. Frankie would weave along the bar, following Johnny, holding his drink aloft. Frankie threw back the last of his drink, giving Joe the break he needed to get on out of there. Joe darted off, set the restroom door swinging. Frankie looked around after he'd finished his drink, and turning back to the bar, he motioned to Big Johnny. Johnny stalked over and stared Frankie down. "Cutting you off for the night, Frankie. Get out." Frankie straightened up and assumed the look of a righteous, drunken indignation. But it wasn't exactly a new turn of events. Fine. I was just on my way home anyway." His hand flopped into his pocket, and Johnny heard the jingle of keys. "Call a cab, Frankie. There's no way you're driving home like that." Frankie spun on his heel and fell against the bar. "You should have thought of that before you told me to leave." And he stomped out of the bar, slamming the door shut behind him. Johnny sighed and went back to work. Not his problem. Frankie managed to get the car started and pulled out of the parking lot, doing so with great care, but still nearly backing into another car. He spun the wheel sharply to the right and managed to avoid it, and he was headed on his way down the road. While going down the highway, which thankfully was more or less deserted in this area at this hour, Frankie leaned over his steering wheel and peered so hard through the windshield, keeping his eyes locked onto the road with razor precision. His eyes locked onto the black pavement as he slowly moved out of the lane into the emergency stop-only lane and then off the shoulder completely. Frankie jumped as the car shook. The two right wheels kicking up gravel, headlights caught a quick flash of something blue in front of him. Frankie slammed his foot on the brakes and felt a thump. The car now stopped, headlights beaming absently into the darkness. Frankie sat in his seat, a trickle of fear penetrating his alcohol-induced stupor. A man lay in the grass about 10 feet from his front bumper. Frankie's heart thudded in his chest. Did he hit the guy? He should go check on him. Frankie managed to get the door open after a few tries and left the car running to check on the denim-clad man in the road. But when Frankie got there, the man was already up and walking away from him, headlights lighting up his back. Frankie felt relief flood through him. There weren't even grass stains on the man's jacket. "Hey guy, hey! You okay? Did I hit you?" No response. Frankie ran up behind him. "Hey guy, did I hit ya? 'Cause I didn't mean to. I had a couple of beers, you know. I didn't mean to hit you if I did. Are you okay? You need to go to the hospital or something." Frankie grabbed the man by the shoulders with both hands, spun the blue man around. Black eyes. Frankie let go of the blue man and stared at his hands. He screamed. He backed away and fell over his own feet, kicking and scrambling away from the blue man who had just watched Frankie, smiling, his teeth glinting in the headlights. Frankie managed to get back on his feet and he ran, leaving his car by the side of the road, the lights still illuminating the blue man. Frankie tucked his hands into his armpits and kept running, and didn't stop until he reached his house. He kicked down his own door and burst inside. He panted, looked around the house. Sweat was pouring down his face and his heart was a jackhammer. He ignored it all. He needed to get clean. Had to wash his hands and get clean. He needed hot water. Had to get clean those hands, sterilize them, clean them. He went to his kitchen and ducked down to root through one of the cabinets. He pulled out a pot. He quickly filled it with water and threw it on the stove, turning the burner to full. He watched the metal coils start to glow red hot, bubbled and turn. He waited until the water had reached a rolling boil and thrust his hands in. They turned red and blistered immediately under the water, but Frankie said nothing, just grinned an empty grin and boiled his hands. The grin faded and turned to a snarl. He wasn't clean. He had to get clean. He threw the water off the stove and grabbed the burner directly. Steam rose from his hands and he heard them pop and sizzle. He began to smile again, but that too faded. He removed his hands and they were charred, smoking bits on the hot burner in the shape of hands. He stared at his ruined hand, flesh still popping and smoldering. It wasn't enough, still dirty, and still not clean. He held his hands out from his body as if they were dead animals, and tried to think. He brightened and went out to the garage. He kicked things over, threw things aside, worked himself into a rage until he found it. The gas can for the lawnmower. It was difficult, but he finally managed to get it open and pour a liberal amount of gasoline on each hand. He stood there with his dripping hands and realized he had no way to light them. He began to pound his fist against the wall, and then stopped, and a smile lit up his face. He ran around back to the grill and found a small stick lighter. He scrambled for it, got a grip on it, and began to click it while pointing it at his left hand. There was a gout of flame, and suddenly, both of his hands were burning brightly. Frankie smiled. That was much better. His hands were clean now. Johnny stared at Frankie and wondered what did happen to him the night he left the bar. He'd asked Frankie, but Frankie didn't talk anymore. Not one word. If he wanted a drink, he pointed. No more politics, religion, or weather, just silence. No one knew why he burned off his own hands. It just happened out of the blue. Johnny shrugged. It's just the way things are sometimes. And, boy, this is a lot longer than I thought it was. I think we're just gonna go ahead and cut it right there. We'll see. Hang on. Yeah, I think we'll just cut it right there.
Okay.
Yes, sir. We're already a little bit over, and this is a bit longer than I thought it was. I hope you liked it. Maybe I'll read the rest of it. I think they're kind of like non sequiturs, but it's the same thing that happens anyway. They all meet a blue guy. Interestingly enough, I once saw a blue man in my backyard when I was a child. He was a ghost. He was definitely a ghost. Like full apparition, like...
Really?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
That's why I thought the story was interesting, because like I saw a blue man like that once. I didn't do anything crazy and like cut my hands off, but interesting. I seen it. It was there. I hope you like, comment, and subscribe. Hit that notification bell for us. I hope you have a good evening. I hope you don't pee yourself because you're terrified of stories. Bye.